Darling, I can't sleep beside you anymore. You snore too loudly.
Daniel? Baby, what's wrong?
I can't do this anymore.
Is this because I snore?
She thought he was asking for a quieter night. She didn't know he was ending their marriage. 2:17 in the morning, the exact minute a 19-year marriage quietly ended. Though Ekom-Abasi wouldn't understand that until much later, Ekom-Abasi opened her eyes, and the bed felt wrong before her mind even understood why. No sound, no warmth pressed against her back. Just the hum of the air conditioner and a silence so complete it felt like a held breath. Daniel was sitting up, straight-backed, awake, staring at the wall like it owed him something. Daniel, she whispered. Baby, what's wrong? He didn't turn to look at her, not right away, and that was the first sign. I can't do this anymore, he said, her chest tightened. She sat up too fast, the blanket sliding off her shoulder. Do what? Talk to me. This, he gestured at the bed, at her. At 19 years of marriage folded into one small motion of his hand. I can't sleep beside you anymore, Ekom. And there it was, the thing she'd been bracing for without admitting it to herself. I know I've been loud, she said quickly, the apology already halfway out before he'd even finished accusing her. I ordered a new pillow last week. The doctor said maybe it's my sinuses. We can try. It's not the pillow. Silence sat between them like a third person in the room. Then what is it? Daniel finally turned his head, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not anger, something colder than anger, relief. There's someone else. Words, 2 words undoing 19 years. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. Sujin. Name landed like a stone dropped into still water. She lets me sleep, Daniel said, quiet, almost gentle if cruelty can ever sound gentle. I didn't go looking for it, Ekom, it just happened. In a house where I could finally close my eyes. Ekom-Abasi didn't cry, not yet. Her body hadn't caught up to what her ears had heard. So this is my fault, she said, not a question. A verdict she'd already passed on herself. Daniel said nothing. And his silence answered louder than words ever could. He was gone before sunrise. A suitcase. A car door. The porch light flickering against a driveway that suddenly felt too big for one woman standing in it alone. Across the street, behind a dark window on the second floor of a modest brick building, a Korean man in his early 60s stood very still, coffee cooling in his hand, watching a woman he had never met fall apart on her own front steps at 4 in the morning. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story, but something about the particular way grief bends a person's shoulders. He recognized it instantly, like a language he hadn't spoken in years but never forgot. It was the look of someone convinced she was the reason for her own abandonment. He knew that look. He'd worn it himself once. His phone buzzed against the counter. He glanced down. Unknown, his jaw tightened. He let it ring out. Closed the curtain like he was shutting a door on a version of himself he'd worked very hard to bury. Ekom-Abasi didn't know his name either. Not yet. But in 6 months, both of their lives would be unrecognizable. And neither of them would have believed it, standing where they stood that night. This is her story. And his. And it starts, of all places, with a snore. 19 years earlier, Daniel Etom used to fall asleep with his hand resting on her hip, like he was making sure she was still there. She remembered their first apartment, the one with the radiator that clanked all night and the mattress they bought second-hand because it was all they could afford. He used to laugh, really laugh, head thrown back, at things that weren't even that funny. He used to call her my Ekom, like the name alone was a gift he got to keep. She still remembered one Saturday early on, when they had exactly $11 between them until his next paycheck. He'd taken that $11 and bought her a single sunflower from a corner stand, and they'd eaten rice and stew on the floor of their empty living room because they didn't own a table yet, and he'd looked at her like she was the whole reason the room had light in it. One day, he told her that night, I'm going to give you everything. Don't need everything, she'd said. I just need this, just you looking at me like that. He'd promised her he always would. Ekom-Abasi used to believe promises like that were permanent. That was perhaps her first mistake. Not the snoring, not her body, not anything Daniel would later blame her for. Just a young woman's simple, devastating faith that love, once given honestly, stayed that way forever. Somewhere in the middle years, between mortgage payments and 2 kids now grown and gone, something shifted. Slowly. The way a house settles, cracks so fine you don't notice them until the wall finally gives. It started small, a sigh when she rolled over, a pillow moved to the guest room just for a night. Then 2 nights, then most nights. Gotten worse, Daniel told her one evening, not unkindly but not gently either, like he was reporting a fact about the weather. I'll see a doctor, she said she did. Twice. They talked about weight, about age, about sleep position, about 100 small mechanical explanations for a very human ache. She tried the strips, the sprays. Sleeping propped up on 3 pillows like a queen on a throne she never asked for, Daniel's patience thinned with every failed attempt. Though looking back much later, Ekom-Abasi would wonder whether it had really been the snoring wearing thin at all, or whether he'd simply been searching for a reason his conscience could live with. Maybe it's not that serious, she offered once, trying to find her way back to the woman who used to make him laugh. It's serious to me, he said. I can't function at work. I'm exhausted, Ekom. She started apologizing before he even opened his mouth. A reflex. A flinch built out of repetition. Every cough, every sniffle at night, she'd wake up already saying sorry, like her own breathing had become something to be forgiven for. And here is the terrible, quiet thing about shame. It doesn't ask permission before it moves in. It doesn't announce itself. It just settles. The way Daniel's disappointment settled into the corners of their marriage until Ekom-Abasi genuinely began to wonder if there was something fundamentally wrong with her. Not her breathing. Her. As a woman. As a wife. As someone worth choosing, night after night, for the rest of a life, she'd catch herself looking in mirrors differently. Softer stomach, graying edges at her hairline. 59 years old, and suddenly convinced that her body, this body that had carried 2 children and 30 years of love, had become a burden to the one person who was supposed to carry it with her. Maybe he's right, she thought one night. Staring at the ceiling, alone in what used to be their bed. Maybe I really am the problem. That thought would follow her for months. She didn't know yet how wrong it was. She called her 2 children the week after Daniel left, dreading the conversation more than almost anything else. Her son went quiet on the phone for a long time before saying simply, Mom, none of this is because of you. I need you to hear that. Her daughter was angrier. He said what? Because you snore. Mom, that's not a reason to end a marriage. That's an excuse. Maybe, Ekom said, unconvinced. Maybe, her daughter said firmly. Definitely. Ekom thanked them both, hung up, and sat with the phone in her lap for a long time. It was strange, she thought, how easily her own children could see the truth of it when she herself was still so tangled up in the fear that somehow, somewhere, she deserved this. Children see their mothers clearly sometimes, in ways mothers have forgotten how to see themselves. By the time Daniel moved out, Ekom-Abasi had already met the woman he was leaving her for, though she didn't know it at the time. Soo Jin-han had been Daniel's executive assistant for 2 years. Sharp, composed, the kind of woman who remembered exactly how you took your coffee after hearing it once. Ekom had seen her at office holiday parties. Polite smiles across a crowded room, nothing more. Soo-jin has this way of just understanding what I need before I say it, Daniel told her once, months before the marriage ended, back when he still came home most nights. She reorganized my whole calendar. Saved me 2 hours a day. That's her job, Ekom said, half joking. It's more than that, Daniel replied, and something in his tone made Ekom's stomach turn, though she couldn't name why yet. She stopped by his office once, unannounced, with lunch she'd made because he'd sounded tired on the phone that morning. She found Soo-jin already at his desk, 2 containers of takeout open between them, the 2 of them laughing over something on a laptop screen. Ekom, Daniel said, straightening quickly, almost guiltily, though he'd done nothing wrong. Not yet, not officially. I didn't know you were coming by. I made your favorite, Ekom said, holding up the container, suddenly feeling absurd for having done so. That's so sweet, Soo-jin said smoothly, gathering her things with practiced ease. I should let you 2 catch up. She left with a polite nod, and Daniel thanked Ekom for the food, ate 3 bites, and spent the rest of the visit checking his phone. Ekom drove home with the leftover lunch untouched on the passenger seat, and a small, cold thought she couldn't quite shake. She hadn't been unwelcome, exactly, she'd simply been extra. A guest in a rhythm that had already learned to run without her. She started noticing things, small things, the new cologne, the late nights described as quarterly reviews. The way Daniel's phone, once left carelessly on the counter for years, suddenly required a passcode. Once, passing his office door, she caught him saying, once things settle into the phone, in the tone of a man discussing plans that were already half made. She told herself she was being paranoid. Insecure. A woman getting older watching shadows where there weren't any. Then she saw them. a work event. Daniel's hand resting on the small of Sujin's back for half a second too long. A private joke that made them both laugh in a way that had nothing to do with the room around them. Sujin looked up. Their eyes met across the crowd. No smirk. No cruelty, just a small, knowing acknowledgement. The look of a woman who already understood something Ekom-Abasi hadn't caught up to yet. That look hurt worse than any insult could have. What does she have that I don't? Ekom whispered to herself in the car afterward, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles went pale. She didn't hate Sujin yet. Not really. Mostly she hated the question that wouldn't stop circling in her head, over and over at 2 a.m. every single night. What's wrong with me? For 3 weeks after Daniel left, Ekom-Abasi barely left the house. Then one Tuesday morning, staring at her own reflection, puffy-eyed and exhausted from another sleepless night, blaming her own body for a man's decision, something in her shifted. "'Kay," she said out loud to the empty bathroom. "Enough. Enough crying, enough believing the lie that she was disposable, but also enough hiding from the actual problem. Because here's the truth Ekom-Abasi had to face, and it takes real courage to face it. Even if Daniel was a coward, even if his reasons were selfish and his timing was cruel. The snoring was real. It had gotten worse. It had cost her sleep, cost her energy, cost her the kind of confidence that lets a woman walk into a room and simply exist without apologizing for the space she takes up. She could hate herself for it, or she could finally, actually, deal with it. A problem is something you fix. A person is not something you fix. Somewhere in the last 3 weeks, without quite noticing, she had started confusing the two. So she did what a lot of women her age quietly do at 2 a.m. when nobody's watching. She started researching. Not out of shame this time. Out of something closer to defiance. She tried a chin strap that made her look, in her own words, like a woman being kidnapped by her own pillow. She recorded herself sleeping and nearly died of embarrassment listening to the playback the next morning, laughing so hard through the humiliation that she almost cried again, but for a different reason this time. She tried nasal strips, a different sleeping position, cutting wine at dinner. She even tried sleeping with 3 pillows stacked behind her, upright as a queen, until she woke at 3 a.m. having slid sideways into a heap on the floor and lay there laughing at the ceiling until she cried. And honestly, at that point, she couldn't tell you which one she was doing more of. Some nights it helped a little. Some nights, nothing helped at all. She called her sister in Houston one evening, half joking, half desperate. "I feel like I'm auditioning for my own marriage," she said. "Like if I just find the right combination of pillow and spray and strip, maybe I get to keep my life." "Ekom," her sister said gently, "you already had your life. He just didn't want to stay in it." Ekom didn't have an answer for that. Not yet. It was on one of those exhausted, 3 a.m. scrolling sessions, half frustrated and half hopeful, that she came across something different from the gadgets and gimmicks crowding her search results. Not a device, not a miracle spray promising overnight results. Just words, honest ones, written like someone who had actually lived the shame of it, not just studied it from a distance. It was called When Snoring Steals the Night. A short, practical guide about what actually causes it, what genuinely helps. And something Ekom-Abasi hadn't expected to find in a sleep guide at all. A section on rebuilding the confidence that quietly erodes when you start believing your own body is something to apologize for. She read the whole thing in one sitting. Twice. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel broken. She felt informed, which, it turns out, is a very different feeling altogether. If any part of this feels a little too familiar, it's linked in the pinned comment, the description, and the code on your screen. Not because Ekom needed saving. Because the bravest thing a woman can do is stop guessing in the dark and get real answers. And if you're the kind of woman who watches someone else start healing and quietly decides it's her turn too, stay close. Tap that little bell so you're here the night everything changes. Now back to Ekom. Because her story was about to take a turn nobody, including Ekom-Abasi herself, saw coming. Slowly, in small, unremarkable ways, she started saying yes again. To a coworker's lunch invitation. To a walk around the block after dinner instead of straight to bed. To leaving the house after dark without needing a reason ready in case anyone asked. Nothing dramatic. Just a woman quietly choosing to keep participating in her own life. On a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the guide, 4 weeks after Daniel, Ekom-Abasi found herself standing outside a small Korean restaurant 2 blocks from her house. She'd walked past it 100 times and never gone in. Tonight, exhausted from another long day of pretending she was fine at work, she didn't have the energy to cook. So she went in. "Table for one?" a voice asked. She looked up. A man, early 60s maybe, quiet eyes, a face that looked like it had survived things it never talked about. Something about him felt familiar, though she couldn't place why. "Yes," she said. "Just me." He noticed the wedding ring still on her finger. She hadn't taken it off yet, hadn't found the strength, but he said nothing about it. Just led her to a table by the window. "Rough week?" he asked, setting down a menu. "Rough month," she said, and laughed, surprising herself with how easily it came out. "Would you like to talk about it, or would you like me to simply bring you the good soup and pretend I didn't ask?" She actually laughed again, a real one this time. "Soup," she said. "Definitely the soup." He brought it himself a few minutes later, sat down across from her unbidden like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I'm having the worst week of my entire life," she admitted, not sure why she was telling a stranger this. "My husband left me, for his secretary, younger. Prettier, probably, and you want to know the reason he gave me?" The man raised an eyebrow, waited. "I snore," she said, and let out a short, bitter laugh. 19 years of marriage, and it ends because I snore." She expected him to laugh too. Politely, maybe. Most people did, not knowing what else to do with a confession like that. He didn't laugh. "Then perhaps," he said slowly, "he left because he couldn't handle a problem." She blinked. "That," he continued, "is not the same thing as you being the problem." Ekom-Abasi went completely still. Nobody had said that to her, not her sister, not her closest friend. Nobody had drawn that line so simply, so cleanly between what Daniel struggled with and what Daniel decided she was worth because of it. "Minyi," the man said, extending a hand. "Ekom-Abasi," she replied, shaking it. "Most people call me Ekom." He repeated, like he was setting the name carefully somewhere he intended to keep it. "Come back anytime." The soup only gets better with practice. She walked home that night feeling something she hadn't felt in weeks, not fixed, not healed, just seen. 2 nights later, unable to sleep, Ekom-Abasi found herself cleaning out an old email account she rarely used anymore, the one Daniel used to message her on before they both switched to texting. Buried 6 months deep in the inbox, she found a message from Daniel to an unknown address she didn't recognize. She almost scrolled past it. Then she read the subject line. "Long are you going to keep pretending?" Her stomach dropped. She opened it. The email was dated 6 months before Daniel's first serious complaint about her snoring. 6 months. She read message after message after message. Daniel discussing moving forward. Daniel discussing finances, restructured accounts, an apartment he'd apparently already looked at. Daniel writing to Sujin, because of course it was Sujin, about a future that very clearly did not include his wife of 19 years. The snoring complaints hadn't started the marriage's collapse. They'd been the cover story for one that had already happened. Ekom-Abasi sat on her kitchen floor at midnight, laptop glowing against the dark, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not sadness this time, something colder, sharper. "You didn't leave because I snore," she whispered to an empty kitchen. "You'd already left. You just needed a reason that made it sound like it wasn't your fault." She closed the laptop. She didn't cry. For the first time since that horrible night at 2:17 in the morning, Ekom-Abasi felt something other than shame. She felt clarity. And clarity, it turns out, is a very dangerous thing to hand an angry woman who's finally done apologizing. Over the following weeks, Ekom-Abasi found herself back at Minyi's restaurant more often than she probably should have. She told herself it was the soup. It was not the soup. They talked easily. About her job, her grown children, the garden she'd let go wild since the divorce papers arrived. He listened in a way most people didn't anymore fully, without reaching for his phone, without waiting for his turn to speak. One night, she came in soaked from an unexpected downpour, hair plastered to her forehead, mascara doing something tragic under each eye, and instead of apologizing for her appearance the way old Ekom would have, she just laughed at herself and said, "Well, this is who I am tonight." Minyi handed her a towel from behind the counter without a word, then brought her tea instead of soup. "You didn't ask what I wanted," she said. "You looked like you needed warm hands more than a full stomach," he said. Was I wrong? She wasn't used to being read that correctly. Not anymore. Another evening, she caught him teaching one of his young kitchen staff how to fold dumplings properly, patient in a way that had nothing to do with running a business and everything to do with simply enjoying the teaching itself. "Good with people," she told him afterward. Something flickered across his face, there and gone. "I wasn't always," he said quietly. "I'm still learning how to be again." She didn't push. But she filed that sentence away too, next to all the others that didn't quite add up yet. He told her almost nothing about himself. Not where he was from originally, not what he did before the restaurant, not why a man who ran a small neighborhood kitchen sometimes looked, for half a second, like he was bracing for an attack that never came. She noticed things. Small things, once. An older Korean man bowed low at the door and addressed him with something that wasn't a name at all, a title, before Min-Yi's sharp glance sent the man quietly back out again. Old business partner, Min-Yi said afterward, not quite meeting her eyes. Confused me for someone else. She let it go. Mostly, though, she noticed, a few nights later, how still he went watching a black sedan idle outside for nearly 20 minutes before it finally pulled away. Everything all right? She'd asked. Everything is fine, he said, in the tone of a man who'd said that sentence 1,000 times without meaning it once. There was, too, the evening she'd arrived early and found him standing in the back office, staring at a small wooden box he quickly closed and set aside when he noticed her in the doorway. What was that? She'd asked. Nothing important, he said, too fast. She'd caught a glimpse before the lid closed. A ring. Heavy, gold, engraved with a crest she didn't recognize, the kind of thing that belonged in a vault, not a drawer behind a soup kitchen counter. She said nothing about it. But she noticed the way his hands had trembled, just slightly, closing that box. And then there were the calls, always the same unknown number, always Seoul. He stepped outside every time to take them, voice dropping too low to follow, his shoulders squaring like a man bracing for weather only he could see coming. Once she caught only the tail end of one, something final, something tired, the kind of sentence a person says when they've said it many times before and are running out of patience for saying it again. Ekom-Abasi didn't need every word. The pieces she caught were enough to know that Min-Yi, gentle, funny, soup-making Min-Yi, was carrying something heavy behind that quiet face. She didn't ask, not yet. She had enough weight of her own to carry. Then, 6 weeks after he left, Daniel called. I miss home, he said, voice softer than she'd heard it in years. I miss talking to you, Ekom, actually talking, not just existing in the same house. Her heart, traitor that it was, softened despite everything she now knew. Maybe we made a mistake, he continued. Maybe I was going through something and I handled it badly. Handled it badly. Like betraying 19 years was a scheduling error still. Some small, aching part of her wanted to believe him. Wanted the version of Daniel, who used to fall asleep with his hand on her hip, to be real, to be reachable, to still exist somewhere underneath the man who'd left her crying on a porch at 4 a.m. They met for coffee. He held her hand across the table, the way he used to, and for a moment she let herself forget everything she'd read in that old email account. Remember the apartment with the radiator, he said, smiling. God, that thing was loud. Almost as loud as me, apparently, Ekom said, and immediately hated herself a little for still reaching for a joke to soften his guilt. That's not fair, Daniel said quietly. None of this was fair to you, I know that. Then why did you do it? He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. I got scared, he finally said. Getting older, watching my whole life turn into routines. Soojin made me feel like I still mattered to someone new. It wasn't about you not being enough, Ekom. It was about me being a coward. It was, she would later realize, the closest thing to the truth he'd told her in over a year. I want to try again, he said. Properly this time, no excuses. For 3 days, Ekom-Abasi let herself hope. On the 4th day, she saw him, downtown, laughing with Soojin outside a restaurant, her hand tucked into the crook of his elbow like it had never left. The hope died fast, faster than it had grown. She sat in her car outside that restaurant for 20 minutes, gripping the wheel, feeling something ugly and familiar rise up in her chest. Not heartbreak this time. Humiliation. She'd been played. Twice now. Once by a man pretending her body was the problem, and once by the same man pretending his heart had changed. She drove straight to Min-Yi's restaurant that night. Didn't order soup. Just sat at the counter until closing, saying nothing, until he finally sat down across from her. You look like someone who needs to talk, he said gently. Look like someone who's tired of being someone's fallback plan, she said. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered something better. Then don't be. Weeks later, at a charity gala Ekom-Abasi had been talked into attending by an old friend, Daniel arrived. With Soojin on his arm, Ekom-Abasi froze near the bar, drink in hand, watching the room shift its attention like a tide pulling toward the shore. Soojin, elegant in deep red, caught sight of her and smiled, the kind of smile that isn't really a smile at all. Ekom, Sujin said, approaching with Daniel trailing slightly behind, visibly uncomfortable. I didn't know you'd be here. Neither did I, apparently, Ekom said evenly. A small cluster of guests had begun listening, the way people always do when tension crackles in a room. I heard the funniest thing, Sujin continued, voice pitched just loud enough. That Daniel left because you snored so badly he couldn't sleep in his own house. Someone near the bar actually laughed. A short, ugly bark of a sound. Ekom-Abasi felt her face go hot. Felt every eye in that section of the room land on her at once. Felt, for one terrible second, exactly like the woman she used to be apologizing before anyone even finished the sentence. Then something in her steadied. Right, Ekom said, calm, clear, loud enough for the small crowd to hear. Sujin blinked, thrown off by the agreement. I did snore, Ekom continued. Badly, actually, woke myself up plenty of nights. A small pause. But you know what's interesting? Some people, when they love you, they figure out how to hold your hand through the hard nights. She looked directly at Daniel. And some people just leave, and then they need a reason that makes it sound like it wasn't a choice. She turned back to Sujin, unbothered, almost gentle. Some people should know when to leave a conversation, too. And she walked away, didn't storm off, didn't cry, just turned, drink still in hand, and walked calmly toward the exit while the room, for the first time all night, went genuinely quiet. She didn't need to destroy Sujin. She'd simply refused to beg. Daniel followed her out to the parking lot, jaw clenched. You embarrass me in there, he snapped. You embarrassed yourself the moment you brought her to a party you knew I'd be at, Ekom shot back. This is exactly why I... Finish that sentence, Ekom said, voice suddenly dangerously calm. Finish it, Daniel, tell me again it's about my snoring, I dare you, he faltered, just slightly, just enough for her to see it. A shadow fell across the pavement between them. Minyi, who'd apparently followed her out at some distance, stepped forward. Saying nothing at first, just standing. This doesn't concern you, Daniel snapped at him. Right, Minyi said evenly. It doesn't. He began to walk away, then stopped, turned back unhurried. But you should be careful, he said, voice low, about making problems for people who don't have anything left to lose. Daniel laughed, a short, dismissive sound. Is that supposed to scare me? Minyi didn't answer. He simply looked at Daniel for a long moment, the kind of look that carries more weight than a raised fist ever could, and then walked back inside. Daniel scoffed and muttered something about the restaurant guy under his breath. But Ekom-Abasi noticed something. In that brief exchange, Daniel, loud, confident, self-assured Daniel, had gone very quiet. She didn't know why yet, but she filed it away. That night, sitting alone in her kitchen with a cup of tea going cold between her hands, she called her sister again. I did it, Ekom said. I stood there in front of all those people and I didn't shrink. How did it feel? Ekom thought about it honestly, turning the question over before answering. Terrifying, she said, and then about 10 seconds later, it felt like breathing for the first time in months. Her sister laughed softly on the other end. That's growth, Ekom. Growth is supposed to feel like that. Ekom looked out the kitchen window, toward the street, toward the small glowing light 2 blocks down where a certain restaurant stayed open past closing for anyone who needed somewhere warm to sit. I think, she said slowly, I might actually be all right. It was the first time she'd said it out loud and meant it. A week later, going through old financial documents to prepare for the divorce proceedings, Ekom-Abasi found something Daniel had clearly hoped she never would. A pattern of transfers. Payments to Sujin months before the marriage officially ended, disguised as consulting fees. Evidence that could not only humiliate Daniel publicly but potentially cause real professional damage, the kind of damage that ends careers. For one long night, she sat with that evidence glowing on her laptop screen, and she felt something dark and tempting bloom in her chest. She could post it. All of it. Let the whole world see exactly what kind of man Daniel Etom really was. She actually opened a blank post, typed the first line, deleted it, typed it again, angrier this time, deleted it again. Some small, honest part of her whispered a question she didn't want to hear. Was this about justice, or was this about making him hurt the way she'd hurt? Measure for measure, humiliation for humiliation. She thought about the nights she'd spent apologizing for her own breathing, about the porch light at 4 a.m, about Sujin's not-quite smile across a crowded room. Didn't he deserve to feel even a fraction of that? Maybe, but deserving something and needing to be the one who delivers it. Those, she was starting to understand, were 2 very different things. She brought it to Minyi the next evening, not entirely sure why he felt like the right person to bring it to. If I destroy her, Ekom said, staring at her hands. Will I finally be free? Maybe, Minyi said. Or will you simply spend another year thinking about her instead of him? He let that settle. Revenge has a strange trick, Ekom. It convinces you the finish line is right there. And then you cross it and somehow she's still living in your head, just wearing a different expression. Ekom-Abasi closed the laptop. She didn't post it, not because she'd forgiven him, not because she was too gentle to fight. She simply understood, finally, that she no longer needed to hurt him to prove to herself that she could, but someone had already noticed she had it. Now, before we go any further, I want you to think for a second. Who do you think Minyi really is? What do you think he used to be before the soup, before the quiet restaurant, before he became the man watching a stranger cry through his window at 4 a.m? Drop your guess in the comments. I promise you, the truth is stranger than anything you're imagining right now. 2 days after Ekom-Abasi decided not to release the financial documents, Sujin walked into Minyi's restaurant for the first time. Alone, uninvited. Scouting, though she'd never admit that to herself, she saw him behind the counter, sleeves rolled up, laughing quietly at something one of his staff had said, and she went completely still. No, she whispered. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands, searching an old, buried photograph from years ago, back when she'd worked briefly in Seoul before moving to the States. A photograph from a business gala she'd barely attended, of a man standing at the center of a room like the room itself belonged to him. The face was older now, softer around the eyes, but it was unmistakable. She left without ordering. Found Daniel that evening, practically shaking. Do you know who that man is? She demanded. The one from the restaurant, Ekom's little friend. Daniel frowned. The restaurant owner, quiet guy, makes soup. That's Han Minyi, Daniel blinked. Who? The man people in Seoul stopped even saying the name of, Sujin said, voice tight. Daniel, that man used to control half the shipping routes in 3 countries. People who crossed him disappeared, and you told him to his face that he didn't concern you. Daniel actually laughed, though it came out thinner than he intended. That's ridiculous. That guy makes soup for a living. But Sujin wasn't laughing. That night, alone in the apartment she'd built with Daniel's money and her own careful ambition, Sujin sat staring at that old photograph until the screen dimmed and locked itself over and over. She hadn't chosen Daniel by accident. She'd chosen a man with status, with comfort, with a life that looked, from the outside, like safety. She had wanted that life. Genuinely wanted it, in the quiet, practical way people want things that solve problems they're tired of solving alone. She had not planned for a ghost from Seoul to reappear 2 blocks from her boyfriend's ex-wife's new favorite restaurant. This isn't my problem, she whispered to the empty apartment, trying to convince herself. I don't know him. He doesn't know me. But some old instinct, sharpened over years spent adjacent to men who wielded real power, told her otherwise. Men like Han Minyi didn't simply retire. They waited. And Ekom-Abasi, unknowingly, unbothered, was sitting across from one of them every single week, sharing soup and small laughter, completely unaware of the storm she'd wandered into the calm eye of. Because Sujin understood something Daniel didn't yet. Powerful men don't disappear because they lose interest. They disappear because something broke them so completely that power itself stopped mattering. And that should have frightened Daniel far more than it did. The truth about Han Minyi unfolded slowly, in pieces, the way grief usually does. Ekom-Abasi found the first piece by accident, a photograph, half hidden in a drawer at the back of the restaurant office, of Minyi standing beside a young man in his 20s, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. My son, Minyi said quietly when he caught her looking. Jun-ho! Has your smile, Ekom said gently. Had, Minyi corrected. And the single word carried the weight of a mountain. Over the following days, in careful, unhurried fragments, he told her. He had once run one of the largest business empires in Korea, legitimate on paper, deeply entangled underneath with something far darker. A rival syndicate had challenged his position for years. He had won every battle, every single one, except the last. Jun-ho, 26 years old, full of the same dry humor his father carried, had been caught in the crossfire of a rivalry he'd never asked to inherit. Minyi had crushed the syndicate responsible within weeks. Total, decisive victory, and it had meant absolutely nothing. I won everything, Minyi told her, voice steady in the way that only comes after years of forcing steadiness onto unbearable pain. The empire, the war, every single asset they had, I won all of it. And I still buried my son. He told her about the night he got the call, how he'd been in a meeting, brokering the very peace terms that would have ended the conflict without another drop of bloodshed, when his phone rang with a number he'd trained himself to answer immediately, no matter what. They found him 3 streets from his own apartment, Minyi said. He wasn't even supposed to be a target. He was collateral. A message meant for me, delivered to the one person I would have burned the entire world down to protect. What did you do? Ekom asked quietly. Exactly what they expected me to, he said. I burned the world down anyway. It didn't bring him back. It just left me standing in the ashes, chairman of nothing that mattered anymore. He touched the edge of the photograph gently, like it might still bruise. That ring you saw, he added, almost as an afterthought, in the box. It was his. He never got to wear it. He'd walked away from all of it after that, relinquished control of the businesses, donated nearly a third of everything he owned, disappeared from a life where his name alone used to move markets, and moved into a quiet apartment 2 blocks from a small restaurant he now ran himself, cooking soup for strangers who had no idea what he used to be. There was nothing worth ruling, he said, after Junho was gone. Ekom-Abasi sat with that for a long moment. You built an entire second life, she finally said, just to escape the first one. I built a smaller life, Minyi corrected, because the big one had already taken everything that mattered. Ekom understood in that moment that she wasn't the only person at that table who had spent years learning to survive something that broke her open. She had lost the identity she'd built around being someone's wife. He had lost the identity he'd built around being untouchable. Neither of them, it turned out, was only the role they used to play. When Ekom-Abasi finally confronted him with everything Sujin had discovered, Minyi didn't deny a single word of it. You lied to me, she said, standing in his small kitchen, arms crossed, more hurt than angry. Yes, he said simply. Are you dangerous? A long pause. I used to be. Now, he said, meeting her eyes directly. I am trying very hard not to be. She wanted to stay angry. It would have been easier. But something about the raw honesty in his answer made anger difficult to hold on to. Why me? She asked. Of all the people in the city, why did you sit down at my table that first night? Minyi was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with obvious care. I saw you before that night, he admitted. Through my window, the morning your husband left, I watched you standing on your porch, and I recognized something in the way you stood there, broken but still standing. He paused. You reminded me of the last night I saw my son alive. Ekom-Abasi's breath caught. This wasn't romance. This was something rawer, more honest than romance, a man admitting that grief had made him watch a stranger's pain because it was the only language he still understood fluently. I'm sorry, she whispered. About your son. I'm sorry, he said. About your marriage. They stood there, 2 people who had both been taught in very different ways that loss was simply the price of having loved anything at all. Daniel didn't back down easily. Frightened by what Sujin had told him, and somehow still arrogant enough to believe his temper mattered more than the truth, he confronted Ekom-Abasi outside her house 3 days later, voice raised, finger pointed. You think you can humiliate me and just walk away? You think your little gangster friend scares me? Minyi arrived moments later, having seen the confrontation from across the street. He stood back, watching, waiting. Everyone, Daniel included, expected him to step in, to use whatever remained of his old power to end this instantly. Instead, Ekom-Abasi held up a hand toward Minyi, stopping him where he stood. I don't need another man deciding who gets punished because of me, she said, loud enough for both of them to hear. I've spent 19 years letting a man's opinion decide what I was worth. I'm done handing that power to anyone, including you, Minyi. Minyi stopped completely still. The old version of him, the chairman, the man who solved every problem with total, overwhelming force, would have found that unbearable, would have needed to fix it, dominate it, end it decisively. The new version of him, the one 2 years and one devastating loss in the making, simply nodded. Understood, he said quietly. Later that night, once Daniel had driven off and the street had gone quiet again, Minyi found her sitting on her porch steps, exactly where she'd stood the night her marriage ended. That took real restraint, Ekom said. I could see it costing you something back there. It did, he admitted. Every instinct I spent 30 years building told me to end that conversation permanently. Didn't you? Because the old version of me solved problems by removing people, he said. And I watched what that cost me. I'm not interested in protecting you by becoming a man you'd eventually have to be afraid of too. Ekom looked at him for a long moment. That, she said quietly, might be the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me, and it wasn't even trying to be. He stepped back. Let her handle her own war. And in that single moment of restraint, Han Minyi proved something far more important than any old reputation ever could, that he had actually changed. Daniel had controlled her for years with shame disguised as concern. Minyi had more power than Daniel would ever have, and he used exactly none of it against him. That, more than anything Minyi used to be, was what finally made her trust him. Daniel, however, hadn't learned his lesson. A week later, cornered by growing pressure at his firm after an anonymous tip surfaced questions about certain consulting payments, Daniel showed up at Minyi's restaurant, red-faced and desperate. "This is you," he snarled. "You did this." "I didn't touch your finances," Minyi said calmly, wiping down the counter. "You did that yourself months ago. You think your money scares me?" Minyi actually smiled, small and humorless. "I don't have much money anymore." Daniel laughed, though it came out shakier this time. "Then what exactly am I supposed to be afraid of?" "That's precisely why you should be more worried," Minyi said, setting down the cloth, meeting Daniel's eyes fully for the first time. "When I had everything, Daniel, I had something to lose. People like that, they're careful, they negotiate." He let the silence stretch. "I don't have anything left to lose." Daniel's bravado cracked just slightly around the edges. "What do you want?" he finally managed. "Nothing from you," Minyi said. "You've already done the damage yourself. Every transfer, every message, every lie, you left the evidence sitting in plain sight because you never believed anyone would bother looking." He wasn't threatening violence. He didn't need to. Legitimate records. Financial irregularities. Misconduct that had nothing to do with any old criminal past and everything to do with Daniel's own carelessness. The trap Daniel found himself walking into wasn't built by a dangerous man calling in dangerous favors. It was built by Daniel Etom, one selfish decision at a time, and simply left waiting for him to finally step into it. The final unraveling happened, fittingly, in Ekom-Abasi's old kitchen, the same kitchen where 19 years of marriage had quietly worn thin. Daniel arrived asking for a conversation. Ekom-Abasi, calmer now than she'd been in months, agreed to one final one. "Need you to understand something," Daniel started, voice unusually small. "I already do," Ekom said. "No," he said. "Let me finish, please," she waited. "Snoring," he said. "It was real. I wasn't lying about that part, but it wasn't why I left." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I'd already fallen out of love with you, Ekom. Long before any of that, I didn't know how to say it. I didn't know how to be the man who just admits that. So I found a reason that sounded acceptable. One that didn't make me the villain." Silence. "You were allowed to fall out of love with me, Daniel," Ekom said finally, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. "That happens, people change, marriages end, that I could have survived." She stepped closer. "You were not allowed to make me hate myself for it." Daniel opened his mouth, closed it again. "You didn't just leave my marriage," Ekom continued, and here her voice finally cracked, just slightly, just once. "You made me ashamed of myself. For months, Daniel, months of believing my own body made me unlovable, because it was easier for you to blame my breathing than admit you'd simply stopped choosing me. Ekom, I'm not finished being angry," she said, "but I'm finally done being ashamed." Daniel stood there a long moment, hands hanging useless at his sides, looking at her like he was seeing her clearly for the first time in years. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted quietly. "You don't have to," Ekom said. "I'm not asking you to fix anything, Daniel. I'm not even asking you to understand it. I just needed you to hear it out loud once so it stops living only in my chest." "There any version of this?" he asked. "Where you forgive me?" Ekom thought about that honestly, the way she'd learned to think about hard things now without flinching away from them. "Maybe, one day," she said. "But forgiving you was never going to be the thing that saved me. I already found that on my own." Daniel left that kitchen a smaller man than he'd walked in as, and Ekom-Abasi stood alone in the space where her old life used to be, and for the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel broken. She felt free. In the months that followed, Ekom-Abasi did something almost nobody expected, including herself. She didn't rush into anything. She kept working on the actual problem, the sleep, the breathing, the years of quiet damage, refining it, adjusting it, night by night, until the fear of her own body finally started to loosen its grip. She started painting again, something she hadn't touched since her 20s, and hung the first decent one, a lopsided sunflower, half by accident, half on purpose, right in her kitchen where she'd see it every morning. She bought a red dress she never would have picked before, because red used to feel like a color for women who didn't have anything to apologize for, and she was slowly stubbornly becoming one of those women. She woke up one Sunday, stretched, and realized with something like surprise that she'd slept a full 8 hours. No pillow fortress. No 3 a.m. spiral of shame. Just rest, plain and ordinary, the kind she used to think she'd lost the right to. She stopped checking Daniel's social media. Stopped rehearsing arguments she'd never actually have. Somewhere along the way, without any dramatic turning point, she simply stopped needing revenge at all. Minyi remained close through all of it, not chasing her, not rushing her, just present, soup on hard days, quiet company on ordinary ones, a steady kind of warmth that never once asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was. One evening, months after Daniel had finally faded into a distant, unimportant chapter, Ekom-Abasi sat across from Minyi at his restaurant, long after closing, candlelight flickering between them. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. "Of me?" Minyi asked, half a smile. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Of being happy again, it's been so long, I almost don't remember how it works." Minyi reached across the table and took her hand, gently, like he was asking permission with the gesture itself. "Then," he said, "we can be scared together." She looked at him, really looked. Not at the mystery, not at whatever power he used to hold, not even at the kindness he'd shown her from the very first night. He didn't rush her toward an answer. He simply sat there, holding her hand across the small table, letting the silence be comfortable instead of demanding. "Can I tell you something strange?" she said eventually. "Always. 19 years I measured my worth by whether one man wanted to stay, and somewhere along the way, without meaning to, I think I forgot I was allowed to just exist, separate from being wanted. You are allowed," Minyi said simply. "You were always allowed." "I know that now," she said, and for the first time she truly believed it. "But I want you to know whatever happens between us, that's not why I'm here. I'm not choosing you to fill a hole Daniel left. I already filled it myself." "Then why are you here?" he asked, something soft and almost hopeful crossing his face. She chose him for something much simpler than all of that. He had seen her at her most ashamed, sitting in a restaurant confessing the most embarrassing detail of the worst night of her life. And he had never once asked her to become someone else before he was willing to love her. That, she realized, was worth more than anything money or power or old reputations could ever offer. Months later, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, sunlight cutting soft lines across the bedroom floor, Ekom-Abasi opened her eyes to find Minyi already awake beside her, watching her with a small, quiet smile. "Did I snore?" she asked immediately, half mortified even now. "A little," he admitted. She groaned, pulling the blanket up over her face. "You were still beautiful," he added, gently tugging the blanket back down. She threw a pillow at him. He caught it, laughing, actually laughing, the sound filling the small bedroom like sunlight itself. "Good morning, husband," she said, settling back against him. He kissed her forehead, slow and unhurried, like they had all the time in the world now. Which in a way they finally did. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She glanced over, almost out of habit, a message from Daniel. "I finally understand what I lost." Ekom-Abasi read it once. Felt nothing sharp, nothing bitter, nothing that needed saying back. She deleted it. No speech. No triumphant last word. No need for one. She turned back toward Minyi, toward the quiet, ordinary Tuesday morning waiting for both of them, and let the phone go dark on the nightstand behind her. Across the street, on the second floor of the modest brick building, where a broken man once stood watching a stranger cry on her porch at 4 a.m, the curtains hung open now over an empty apartment. Nobody stood at that window anymore, keeping quiet, careful watch over someone else's pain from a safe and lonely distance. He wasn't watching her life from across the street anymore. He was living it, right beside her, in a house that finally, after everything, felt like home to them both. She had woken up once in the dark, because someone chose to leave. Now she woke in the light, loved by a man who never once needed her to prove she deserved to stay. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about heartbreak while you're living through it. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't making someone regret losing you, it's becoming so whole that you no longer need them to.